A rain-slicked alley in London, October 14th. Clara is trapped between cold brick walls and the shadow of the city's most dangerous man. Elias doesn't want her money. He wants her life to settle her brother's £50,000 debt. He leans in, his breath hot against her skin, and whispers a promise that will haunt her dreams. "I'm going to fill every centimetre of your body with mine." From the grime of the docks to the gilded cages of a secret estate, a terrifying game of power turns into a burning, forbidden passion. Will she survive his obsession, or will they both burn in the fire of a betrayal no one saw coming? Discover a story where the debt is blood and the price is everything. The rain in London did not fall. It drifted like a heavy grey shroud, clinging to the brickwork and soaking through the layers of Clara's threadbare coat. It was October 14th, 2022, a night where the city felt particularly predatory. Clara's breath came in ragged, visible puffs as she navigated the labyrinthine alleys behind the Southwark docks. She was 24 years old, with eyes the colour of a stormy Atlantic, and a spirit that had been slowly eroded by the crushing weight of her brother's failures. Julian had always been the dreamer, but his dreams were built on borrowed money and desperate bets. Now those debts had come calling in the form of a name whispered with fear in every dark corner of the East End: Elias. Clara turned a corner, her boots splashing into a deep puddle, when the world suddenly narrowed. At the end of the narrow passage, a black sedan sat idling, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of a deep-sea monster. She spun around to retreat, but the way was already blocked. Two men, broad-shouldered and silent, stood like monoliths against the damp walls. Then the rear door of the sedan opened. Elias stepped out. He was a man of sharp angles and expensive fabric. His charcoal suit was tailored so perfectly it looked like armor, and his presence alone seemed to drop the temperature of the alley by several degrees. He didn't look like a common thug. He looked like a king who had lost his patience. His hair was dark, slicked back by the mist, revealing a face that was hauntingly handsome but carved from cold marble. "You're a difficult woman to find, Clara," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in the small space between them. Clara backed away until her shoulder blades hit the cold, wet bricks of the warehouse behind her. "I don't have the money, Elias. Julian is gone. I haven't seen him in 3 days." Elias walked toward her with a slow, predatory grace. He didn't stop until he was mere inches away. He was tall, forcing Clara to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The scent of him, expensive tobacco, sandalwood, and the metallic tang of the rain overpowered her senses. He reached out, resting one large, warm hand on the brick wall beside her head, effectively caging her. "I know where Julian is," Elias murmured, leaning closer. The heat radiating from his body was a startling contrast to the freezing night. "But Julian is a ghost. A ghost can't pay a debt of £50,000. Clara tried to swallow, but her throat was dry. "Then what do you want from me? I work 2 jobs. I have nothing." Elias lowered his head, his lips hovering just an inch from her ear. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. His other hand came up, not to strike her, but to trace the line of her jaw with the back of his fingers. The contact was electric, a slow, deliberate graze that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You have yourself," he whispered. His breath was warm against her skin, causing a flush to spread across her chest despite the damp air. "Your brother didn't just gamble with money, Clara. He gambled with his life, and since he has nothing left to give, the debt has moved." He moved his hand from her jaw to the side of her neck, his thumb pressing lightly against her pulsing carotid artery. He could feel her terror, but more than that, he could feel her reaction to him. He leaned in further, his chest almost brushing against hers. The physical proximity was suffocating and intoxicating all at once. Through the thin fabric of her coat, she could feel the hard lines of his torso. "I told my men I would find a way to settle this," Elias continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous silken thread. He looked down at her lips, his eyes darkening with a hunger that wasn't purely about business. He leaned in, his nose brushing against hers, his voice a ghost of a promise against her skin. "I'm going to fill every centimetre of your body with mine until that debt is forgotten." Clara's breath hitched. She should have been repulsed. should have screamed, but the sheer gravity of his presence held her fast. The way his body moved against hers, even through their clothes, felt like a claim being staked. His hand slid into her hair, gripping the strands just firmly enough to keep her focused on him. "You have a choice," he murmured, his lips now brushing the corner of her mouth. "You can go to the authorities, who are already on my payroll, and watch your brother disappear forever. Or you can get into that car and begin your new life as my guest." The rain intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm on the metal bins nearby. Clara looked into his eyes and saw no mercy, only an ironclad will and a burning dark desire that promised to consume her. She thought of Julian, hiding in some hole, terrified for his life. Then she thought of the man standing before her, a man who seemed to offer both destruction and salvation in the same breath. She felt his hand slide down her back, pressing her more firmly against his suit. The intimacy was jarring, a bold declaration of ownership in a public, filthy alleyway. Every nerve ending in Clara's body felt on fire. "Well, Clara?" Elias asked, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "What is it going to be?" Clara looked at the black car, then back at the man who held her fate in his calloused hands. She realized in that moment that her old life, with its quiet struggles and lonely nights, ended the second Elias had stepped into the light. She took a trembling breath, her eyes never leaving his. "Take me to the car," she whispered. Elias smiled, a slow, triumphant curve of his lips that didn't reach his cold eyes. He didn't let go of her. Instead, he steered her toward the vehicle, his hand remaining heavy and possessive on the small of her back, guiding her toward a world of shadows and silk from which there would be no easy escape. As the door clicked shut, sealing them inside the plush, leather-scented interior, Clara felt the first stirrings of a new kind of fear and an even more dangerous curiosity. The interior of the sedan was a silent, leather-scented vacuum that seemed to swallow the sounds of the London night. Outside, the world was a blurred montage of neon signs and rain-streaked windows, but inside, the air was heavy with a stillness that made Clara's ears ring. She sat as far into the corner of the plush seat as possible, her damp coat feeling heavy and alien against the pristine hide of the upholstery. Elias did not look at her. He sat with his legs crossed, one hand resting casually on his knee, the other tapping a rhythmic, thoughtful pattern against the armrest. The golden glow of the passing streetlights danced across his sharp profile, highlighting the ridge of his nose and the hard, uncompromising line of his jaw. He was a man who occupied space with a terrifying level of comfort. "Where are we going?" Clara finally asked, her voice cracking slightly. "To a place where you can be useful," Elias replied, his gaze remaining fixed on the window, "and where I can ensure your brother's mess doesn't spill over into my business any further than it already has." "I can pay you," she blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. "I have 2 jobs, I can take a third. I'll give you every penny I earn. £10, £20 a week. It'll take time, but I'm honest. I'll pay you back every one of those £50,000. For the first time since they had entered the car, Elias turned his head. He didn't laugh, but a small, mirthless smile touched his lips. He leaned across the wide console, and Clara instinctively pressed herself harder against the door. He didn't stop until his face was inches from hers, the heat of his body once again invading her personal space. £50,000, Clara, he said softly, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. At £20 a week, you would be paying me for 2,500 weeks. That is over 48 years. Do I look like a man who has 48 years to wait for a return on an investment? He reached out, his hand moving with a speed that startled her. He didn't grab her. Instead, he hooked 2 fingers into the collar of her wet coat and pulled her forward, just enough to force her to look into his dark, bottomless eyes. "You're thinking like a girl who worries about rent and grocery bills," he whispered, his voice vibrating through her. "I don't care about your pennies. I care about the principle of the debt. Julian stole from me. Not just money, but respect. And when someone takes my respect, I take something of theirs that they value most." His gaze dropped to her throat, then lower, lingering on the rise and fall of her chest. The air in the car suddenly felt much thinner. He valued you. He thought he could hide you away, keep you pure and separate from the filth he played in. He was wrong. Clara felt a hot flush of shame and anger. "You're using me to hurt him." "I'm using you to settle a balance," Elias corrected. His fingers moved from her collar to her cheek, his thumb grazing the corner of her lower lip. The touch was slow, almost tender, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "And I suspect the process will be far more enjoyable than counting crumpled banknotes." The car slowed, turning off the main road and through a set of massive wrought-iron gates that opened silently to greet them. They traveled down a long, winding driveway, lined with ancient oaks that looked like skeletal sentinels in the mist. At the end of the path stood a house that was less of a home and more of a fortress, a sprawling grey stone estate that breathed history and cold, calculated wealth. When the car came to a halt, the driver stepped out to open Clara's door. Elias was already out, standing in the rain without an umbrella, looking up at the darkened windows of his domain. He didn't wait for her. He walked toward the massive oak front doors, his silhouette cutting a jagged hole in the night. Clara hesitated, looking back at the iron gates. They were closed. There was no one on these streets, no one who knew she was here. She stepped out of the car, her wet boots crunching on the gravel. The cold air hit her, but it was quickly replaced by Elias's presence as he waited for her at the threshold. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was large and calloused, his grip firm and undeniable. He didn't lead her so much as he claimed her, pulling her into the warmth of the foyer. The door clicked shut behind them with a finality that sounded like a gavel. The interior was magnificent and oppressive. Polished marble floors reflected the amber light of a massive crystal chandelier. There were no family photos, no signs of comfort, only art that looked expensive and lethal. Elias stripped off his suit jacket, handing it to a silent, elderly man who had appeared from the shadows. Beneath the jacket, his white shirt was stretched tight across a broad chest and powerful shoulders. "Show Clara to the East Suite," Elias commanded the servant, his voice echoing in the vast space. Then he turned back to Clara. He stepped close, his hand moving to the small of her back, guiding her toward the grand staircase. Through the thin fabric of her dress, she could feel every one of his fingers, the heat of his palm seeping into her skin. "Dry yourself, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that made her knees weak. "There is a silk robe on the bed. Put it on. I will be in shortly to discuss the first installment of your brother's debt." He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, his hand tightening slightly on her waist, drawing her hip flush against his. "And Clara, don't bother locking the door. I have the only key that matters in this house." He watched her as she began to climb the stairs, her heart thundering so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Every step felt like a descent further into a dream she couldn't wake up from. When she reached the landing, she looked back. Elias was still standing there, bathed in the amber light, his eyes fixed on her with the unwavering focus of a man who had finally found exactly what he was looking for. She entered the suite and found herself in a room that smelled of jasmine and old wood. On the massive four-poster bed lay a slip of emerald silk. It was beautiful, expensive, and a clear sign of the role she was expected to play. Clara walked to the window, looking out at the rain-drenched gardens, realizing that while she was no longer in that damp alley, the walls around her were now much higher, and the man holding the keys was far more dangerous than any debt Julian had ever managed to accrue. She picked up the silk robe, the fabric feeling like water in her hands, and as she heard the distant sound of a door closing downstairs, she knew her time was running out. The steam from the shower was the only thing that felt real in the vastness of the East Suite. It rose in thick, white plumes, clinging to the dark marble walls and blurring the reflection of a woman Clara barely recognized in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She had scrubbed her skin until it was a faint rosy pink, desperate to wash away the scent of the rain-slicked alley and the ghost of Elias's touch. Yet as the water slicked down her back, she could still feel the phantom weight of his hand on the small of her spine. It was October 14th, 2022, and the world outside these stone walls had ceased to exist. She stepped out of the glass enclosure and reached for the emerald silk robe. It felt dangerously light, a mere whisper of fabric that offered no protection. As she slipped it on, the cool material glided over her damp skin, the hem pooling around her ankles. The robe was cinched at the waist, highlighting the curves she usually hid beneath oversized sweaters and practical coats. She felt exposed, a decorative object prepared for a collector's viewing. The bedroom was silent, save for the crackle of a fire that had been lit while she was in the bathroom. The scent of jasmine and expensive beeswax hung heavy in the air. Clara sat on the edge of the massive bed, her fingers trembling as she gripped the silk. She thought of Julian. Was he safe? Or was his safety merely a lie told by a man who traded in fear? The heavy oak door didn't creak when it opened. It simply swung wide with a silent, authoritative grace. Elias stood in the doorway. He had changed into a black dress shirt, the top 2 buttons undone. His sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faint, jagged scars that spoke of a life far more violent than his current surroundings suggested. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, his gaze traveling slowly from her bare feet up to the pulse point, fluttering wildly in her throat. The silence was a physical weight, pushing the air from the room. "Dinner is served, Clara," he finally said. His voice was lower than before, a rough vibration that seemed to settle deep in her chest. "I'm not hungry," she whispered, though her stomach felt hollow with a mix of hunger and dread. Elias walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped just inches away, the heat of his presence once again overwhelming the cooling air of the room. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his fingers tangled gently in her damp hair, pulling it back to expose the line of her neck. "I do not enjoy a fragile guest," he murmured, his thumb grazing the shell of her ear. "Eat. Keep your strength. You will need it for the days ahead." His touch was a paradox, firm enough to remind her of his power, yet light enough to feel like an invitation. Clara looked up at him, her Atlantic blue eyes bright with defiance. "Is this what you do? Collect women like furniture to fill your empty rooms?" Elias's eyes darkened, a flash of something ancient and predatory flickering in the depths. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her temple. "I have never collected anything I didn't intend to use, Clara. Now, walk." He led her downstairs to a dining room that was a masterclass in oppressive elegance. A long mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, polished to a mirror finish. 2 places were set at the very end, close enough that their knees would almost touch. The room was lit by a dozen tall black candles, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows against the velvet-lined walls. The meal was served by the same silent staff, but Clara could barely taste the rich wine or the perfectly seared meat. She was too aware of Elias sitting across from her. He ate with a methodical, calm precision, his eyes never truly leaving her face. It was a battle of wills conducted in the clink of silver against china. "You look beautiful in green," Elias said, breaking the silence. He leaned back, swirled the dark red wine in his glass, and watched the way the candlelight caught the emerald silk of her robe. "It suits the fire in your eyes. Julian never told me his sister had so much spirit. He mostly talked about how he wanted to protect you from men like me." "He failed," Clara said bitterly. "He didn't fail because he was weak," Elias replied, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous thread. "He failed because he thought he could play a game where the rules are written in blood. He thought he could win without losing anything, but in this city everything has a price, especially safety." He reached across the table. It wasn't a sudden movement, but a slow, deliberate extension of his arm. Clara froze as his large, warm hand covered hers. His palm was broad, his skin slightly rough, and the contact sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through her arm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he began to trace the veins on the back of her hand with his thumb, a slow, rhythmic motion that made her breath hitch. "What is my price, Elias?" she asked, her voice trembling. "When will the 50,000 be enough?" Elias leaned forward, the candlelight reflecting in his dark pupils. He didn't answer with numbers. He stood up, never breaking the contact with her hand, and moved around the table until he was standing behind her chair. He placed his other hand on her shoulder, his fingers pressing into the soft tissue, finding the tension there and kneaded it with a devastatingly effective pressure. "The money is the least interesting thing about you, Clara," he whispered into her hair. He bent down, his chest pressing against her back, the heat of him soaking through the thin silk. He moved his hand from the table to her waist, his fingers splaying across her stomach, pulling her firmly against the back of the chair and his own hard body. Clara felt a wave of heat wash over her. It was a terrifying, heavy sensation that made her want to lean back into him even as her mind screamed to run. The physical contact was detailed, intimate. She could feel the steady thud of his heart against her shoulder blades, the rise and fall of his powerful chest. "I told you," he murmured, his lips grazing the sensitive skin behind her ear. "I am going to fill every centimeter of your life until you forget there was ever a world without me." He stayed there for a long minute, his hands claiming her in the silence of the grand room, before he finally stepped back. The sudden coldness was jarring. "Go back to your room," he commanded, his voice once again the cold steel of the gangster she knew him to be. "Tomorrow, the real work begins. I have people coming. You will be by my side and you will act as if you belong there." As Clara climbed the stairs, her hand still tingling from his touch, she noticed a small framed photograph on a side table in the hallway. It was old, the edges frayed, showing a younger, smiling Elias standing in front of a much humbler building. For the first time, she wondered what had happened in the years between that smile and the man who now held her life in his hands. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of the dining room doors closing, leaving her alone with the echoes of a past she was only beginning to uncover. The morning of October 15th, 2022, arrived with a pale, sickly light that struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains of the East Suite. Clara had spent the night in a state of fitful exhaustion, her dreams haunted by the scent of sandalwood and the phantom pressure of Elias's hands. When she finally rose, the house was eerily silent, the only sound the distant rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the depths of the foyer. Elias was nowhere to be seen. A tray had been left outside her door, coffee, bitter and black, and a plate of fruit that looked too perfect to eat. Clara ignored the food but drank the coffee, the caffeine sharpening the edges of her resolve. She couldn't sit in this room and wait for the next installment of her brother's debt. She needed to understand the man who had turned her life into a hostage situation. She dressed in a simple, high-necked sweater and trousers she found in the wardrobe, all in muted tones of charcoal and navy, clearly chosen to match the house's somber aesthetic. Stepping into the hallway, she felt like a ghost haunting a museum of cold wealth. She remembered the photograph she had seen the night before, the one of a younger, smiling Elias. It had been located near a set of double doors that had remained locked during her initial tour. As she descended the grand staircase, she noted the absence of the staff. It was as if Elias had cleared the stage for her. She reached the hallway and found the small framed photo. The boy in the picture couldn't have been older than 20. He stood in front of a small, cramped auto repair shop in the East End, his arm draped around an older man who shared his sharp features but possessed a warmth Elias now lacked. Clara's fingers traced the edge of the frame. The date on the back of the photo, visible through a crack in the casing, was 2010. Driven by a sudden, reckless curiosity, she tried the handle of the double doors nearby. To her surprise, they gave way with a soft, inviting click. Inside was a library, but not like the rest of the house. This room was warm, the walls lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes that smelled of cedar and aged parchment. In the center of the room stood a massive mahogany desk, and behind it, a smaller, inconspicuous door partially hidden by a heavy tapestry. Clara moved toward the tapestry, her heart hammering. She pulled it aside to reveal a keypad. She hesitated, her mind racing. What could he be hiding? She looked at the desk and noticed a small leather journal. She opened it to a random page. The handwriting was jagged, aggressive, as if the pen had been used as a weapon. November 3rd, 2015, the entry began. The rain didn't stop the fire. They took everything. My father didn't even have time to scream. They think they broke me, but they only stripped away the parts of me that were still human. From today, I am the fire. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She looked at the date again. 7 years ago, a tragedy that had forged the cold, calculating king of the Suffolk docks. She was so absorbed in the entry that she didn't hear the shadow falling across the doorway. Curiosity is a dangerous trait in this house, Clara. She spun around, the journal slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. Elias stood in the entrance, his frame silhouetted by the hallway light. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, his white shirt was open at the collar, and his eyes were dark with a mixture of cold fury and something far more vulnerable. He walked toward her, each step measured and heavy. Clara backed away until her legs hit the mahogany desk. I was just looking for something to read. In my private journals, Elias asked, stopping just inches from her. He reached down and picked up the book, his large hand closing over it with a grip that made the leather groan. This is not a story for a girl like you. This is the blueprint of a man who has nothing left to lose. He dropped the journal on the desk and stepped closer, his presence expanding to fill the space between them. He placed both hands on the desk on either side of her, trapping her. The heat from his body was immediate, a physical wall that pressed against her. "What happened on November 3rd?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper. Her defiance was gone, replaced by a raw need to understand the pain she saw flickering in his gaze. Elias leaned in, his face so close she could see the minute flecks of amber in his dark pupils. His breath, smelling of coffee and the cold morning air, brushed against her lips. "On that day, I learned that mercy is a weakness that gets people killed. I learned that the only way to protect what you love is to become the monster that everyone else is afraid of." He reached out, his hand moving with a slow, deliberate grace to the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in the short hairs at the nape, pulling her head back just enough to force her to meet his gaze. The touch wasn't violent, but it was possessive, a claim that made Clara's breath hitch. "For you think you can find a way to make me human again, don't you?" he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her throat, pressing lightly against the frantic beat of her pulse. "You think if you find the right secret, the right memory, I'll let you go." Clara couldn't look away. The physical proximity was overwhelming. Her chest was inches from his, and with every breath he took, she could feel the hard muscle of his torso through his shirt. "I just want to know who I'm dealing with," she breathed. Elias moved his hand from her neck to her waist, his fingers splaying across her lower back, pulling her flush against him. The contact was electric, a deep, heavy heat that spread from her core to her fingertips. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a ghost of a kiss that was more of a threat than a promise. "You are dealing with a man who has burned everything he ever cared about to build this empire," he whispered, his voice a low, rough growl. He moved his other hand to her jaw, his thumb dragging across her lower lip, pulling it down slightly to reveal the pink of her inner mouth. "And now you are part of that empire." He didn't kiss her. Instead, he buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. She felt the rough stubble of his jaw against her skin, the heat of his breath, and the heavy, solid weight of him against her. For a moment, the gangster was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to be seeking a temporary sanctuary in the very woman he had enslaved. Clara felt her hands rise instinctively, her fingers hovering near his shoulders before she forced them down. She was terrified of him, yes, but in this room, surrounded by the echoes of his tragedy, she felt a dangerous, aching sympathy. "Elias," she whispered. He pulled back, his eyes once again cold and impenetrable. He let go of her, the sudden absence of his heat making her shiver. "Tonight we go to the city," he said, his voice back to its usual authoritative tone. "There is a man who needs to see that I have you, a man who thinks Julian's debt is his to collect." He turned and walked toward the door, stopping only to look back over his shoulder. "Wear the black dress I left in your room, and Clara, don't go looking into the shadows again. You might not like what looks back at you." As the door closed behind him, Clara looked at the hidden keypad behind the tapestry. She realized that the secrets of November 3rd were only the beginning. The real danger wasn't just Elias's past, it was the way her own heart had begun to beat in sync with his, a rhythm of survival and a burgeoning, forbidden desire that threatened to pull her under. The winter of 2023 arrived with a ferocity that seemed to mirror the turbulence within the stone walls of the estate. On December 21st, 2023, A massive storm collided with the city, turning the sky into a bruised purple expanse and whipping the ancient oaks in the garden into a frenzy of skeletal movement. Inside, the house felt like a ship lost at sea, the wind howling through the chimneys and rattling the heavy window panes. Clara sat in the small library she had come to claim as her sanctuary. She was wrapped in a thick, cream-colored wool cardigan, her fingers tracing the spine of a book she wasn't actually reading. It had been 2 months since she arrived, and the lines of her reality had blurred. Elias was no longer just a threat. He was the sun around which her dark world revolved. He was demanding, cold, and often cruel, yet there were moments, small, silent fractures in his armor, that kept her from running, even if she had a place to go. Suddenly the lights flickered twice, then died completely. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thrumming of the rain against the glass. The darkness was thick, velvet-like, and immediate. Clara stayed still, her heart beginning a slow, heavy gallop in her chest. She didn't need light to know he was there. She could feel him. The air in the room shifted, growing denser, warmer. "Don't move, Clara." His voice drifted from the doorway, a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards and up into the soles of her feet. A moment later, a small orange flame bloomed in the darkness. Elias was holding a silver lighter, the flicker illuminating the sharp planes of his face and the intense shadowed hollows of his eyes. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and silent. He set a single black pillar candle on the mahogany desk and lit it. The flame danced, casting long wavering shadows that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. "The storm has taken out the main line," Elias said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "It will be hours before the crews can reach this part of the city." He didn't move away. He stood by the desk, his shadow towering over her. He was wearing a dark sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, and the scent of him, smoke and cold rain, filled her lungs. "You're shivering," he noted. "It's just the cold," Clara lied, though her voice betrayed her. Elias reached out, his hand disappearing into the darkness before his fingers found the side of her neck. His touch was searingly hot against her chilled skin. He didn't pull away. Instead, he slid his hand under the collar of her cardigan, his palm resting against the sensitive curve of her shoulder. The contact was electric, a jolt that made her breath catch in her throat. "Is it?" he murmured, leaning down. The candlelight reflected in his eyes, making them look like molten gold. He moved around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her chair. He placed his hands on the armrests, effectively caging her. The physical proximity was overwhelming. In the flickering light, Clara could see the fine lines around his eyes and the way his lower lip was slightly fuller than the top one. She felt a sudden, desperate urge to reach out and touch him, to see if he was as solid and real as he felt. "I told you once that I would fill every centimeter of your life," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble in his chest. He reached out with one hand, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. His touch was slow, deliberate, dragging across the soft tissue until she instinctively parted her lips. "I haven't been honest with you, Clara." "About what?" she whispered, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could feel it through the air. "About how much I want to destroy the debt just so I can have you without the shadow of your brother between us." He leaned in closer, his nose brushing against hers. The heat radiating from him was a physical force, pushing back the chill of the storm. He moved his hand from her lip to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair and pulling her slightly forward. Clara didn't resist. She couldn't. The tension that had been building for months, the stolen glances, the accidental touches, the heavy silences, was finally reaching its breaking point. He lowered his head, his lips grazing her jawline, moving toward the sensitive spot beneath her ear. Clara let out a soft, broken sound, her eyes fluttering shut. She felt his other hand slide under her cardigan, his warm palm splaying across the small of her back. He pulled her up from the chair and against the hard, uncompromising length of his body. The contact was total. She could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart against her chest, the strength in his arms as he held her, and the raw, unyielding hunger in his touch. Through the layers of their clothes, the heat was stifling, a summer fire in the middle of a winter storm. "Elias," she breathed, her hands finally finding their way to his chest, her fingers clutching the soft wool of his sweater. He didn't answer with words. He captured her mouth with his, a kiss that was both a reclamation and a surrender. It was deep, possessive, and tasted of the wine he had been drinking and the wildness of the night outside. He backed her against the desk, his hands moving with a feverish intensity, tracing the curves of her hips and the line of her spine. The physical details were sharp and overwhelming, the rough texture of his tongue, the way his fingers pressed into her skin, the heavy weight of him as he leaned into her. It was a dance of shadows and skin, a desperate attempt to find warmth in a world that had grown cold and dark. For a moment the gangster and the prisoner disappeared. There was only the storm, the candle, and the two of them, lost in a sea of sensation. Elias pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This changes everything," he whispered, his voice thick with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "You know that, don't you?" Clara looked into his eyes and saw the truth. The debt was no longer about money or Julian. It was about this magnetic, terrifying pull that threatened to consume them both. "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Outside, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the room for a fraction of a second. In that flash, Clara saw Elias's face, raw, exposed, and filled with a longing that mirrored her own. Then the darkness returned, even deeper than before, leaving them alone in the flickering orange glow of the single candle, as the first real spark of their connection threatened to turn into an all-consuming blaze. The intimacy of the storm had shifted the foundation of the estate, but by January 10th, 2024, the warmth of that candle-lit night had been replaced by a cold, sharpened urgency. The city outside was a grey sprawl of ice and secrets, and within the Southwark docks, the whispers were getting louder. Elias's rivals, a ruthless collective known only as the Bridge Boys, were no longer content with the borders of the East End. They were looking at Elias's empire, and they were looking at the woman he had hidden away. Clara stood in the centre of the grand library, the morning light reflecting off the frost-patterned windows. She was no longer wearing the thin silk of a prisoner. She wore a heavy, dark-knit sweater and leather boots, a wardrobe Elias had provided for practicality. "They watched the car yesterday," Elias said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He was standing by the window, his silhouette dark and imposing. He wasn't looking at her, but his focus was entirely on the perimeter of the estate. "Two men in a silver hatchback. They didn't follow us, but they took photos. They know you're not just a guest, Clara." Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you are a vulnerability," Elias said, finally turning to face her. His eyes were hard, the vulnerability of the storm night tucked away behind a mask of professional violence. "And in my world, a vulnerability is something that needs to be either eliminated or hardened." He walked toward her, and for the first time, he wasn't empty-handed. In his right hand he held a sleek, matte-black handgun. The sight of it made Clara's breath hitch, the reality of his life crashing into the quiet of the library. "I'm not a killer, Elias," she whispered, backing away until she hit the edge of the mahogany desk. "You don't have to be a killer," he replied, stopping just in front of her. "You just have to be someone who can't be taken. I can't be with you every second of the day, and the men I pay to stand at the gates can be bought. You cannot." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm and slightly rough. He pulled her forward, not with the predatory aggression of their first meeting, but with a strange, dark, protective instinct. He moved behind her, his large frame shielding her from the rest of the room. "Hold it," he commanded, placing the heavy metal of the weapon into her palm. Clara's hand shook under the weight. The gun felt cold and alien, a piece of machinery designed for one purpose. She tried to pull away, but Elias stepped closer, his chest pressing firmly against her back. He was a solid, living wall of muscle and heat. He reached around her, his large hands covering hers, steadying the trembling steel. "Finger off the trigger," he murmured, his breath hot against the shell of her ear. The sensation sent a jolt of electricity through her, a confusing mix of fear and an undeniable growing attraction. Only put your finger there when you have decided that the person in front of you is no longer a human being, but a threat. He adjusted his stance, spreading his legs and forcing her to do the same. His thighs brushed against hers, the friction of their clothes creating a static charge in the air. He leaned down, his chin resting on her shoulder, his face so close she could see the dark stubble on his jaw. "Firm grip," he whispered. He squeezed her hands, his palms broad and calloused, pressing her fingers into the grip of the pistol. "The recoil will try to jump. You have to dominate it. You have to own the weapon or it will own you." The physical contact was intense and detailed. Clara could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart through his shirt, the expansion of his lungs as he breathed, and the raw strength in his arms as he guided her movements. Every time she moved to adjust her aim, she felt the hard lines of his torso shifting against her spine. It was a lesson in violence, wrapped in an intimate, suffocating embrace. He moved his hand from her grip to her waist, his fingers splaying across her hip to adjust her balance. The touch was lingering, far longer than necessary for a shooting lesson. His thumb traced the curve of her bone, his heat soaking through the fabric of her trousers. "You're a fast learner, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough vibration that made her knees feel weak. "You have the steady hands of someone who has spent her life surviving. Don't stop now." He leaned in, his lips brushing the sensitive skin just below her earlobe. "In this city, everyone wants something from me, my territory, my money, my life. But lately, all they talk about is the woman in the East Suite. They think you're my weakness. I want them to realize you're my greatest weapon." Clara turned her head slightly, her lips inches from his. The air between them was thick with the scent of gun oil and the heavy, musky spice of his cologne. For a moment, the threat of the bridge boys faded, replaced by the magnetic pull of the man holding her. "Why protect me like this?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "Is it still just about the debt?" Elias tightened his grip on her waist, pulling her flush against his hip. The contact was bold, a declaration of a hunger that went far beyond business. His eyes darkened, the amber flecks caught in the morning light. "The debt was settled the moment I tasted you in the storm," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "Now this is about something else entirely. This is about what happens when I decide that what I've claimed is mine to keep, forever." He didn't kiss her. He let go of her hands, the sudden absence of his weight making her feel strangely cold. He stepped back, his expression returning to that of the guarded king. "Keep the weapon under your pillow," he said, his voice now the cold steel of a command. "Tomorrow we go to the range. You need to know what it feels like to actually fire." As he walked toward the door, he stopped and looked back. "And Clara? Keep the curtains closed in the bedroom tonight. I don't like the way the shadows are moving in the garden." He left the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut. Clara looked down at the black handgun in her hand. It felt heavier than before, a physical manifestation of the world she was now irrevocably tied to. She walked to the window and pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of a dark figure standing near the iron gates, perfectly still, watching the house. The circle was closing and the lesson in survival was only just beginning. The silence of the estate was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to amplify every creak of the floorboards and every gust of the winter wind. It was January 15th, 2024, and the world outside was locked in a bitter, bone-chilling frost. Clara sat in the grand library, the black handgun Elias had given her resting on the mahogany desk like a sleeping predator. She had spent the last 5 days practicing her aim at an indoor range, her body still aching from the tension of the recoil and the constant, overwhelming presence of Elias standing right behind her, his hands guiding hers. But today, Elias was gone. He had left before the sun had even managed to break through the grey London mist, heading to the docks to handle a situation with the bridge boys. He had left her with a warning to stay inside, and a kiss that had lingered on her lips long after his car had cleared the iron gates. Left to her own devices, the curiosity that Elias had called dangerous began to claw at her again. She couldn't stop thinking about the hidden keypad and the journal entry from November 3rd, 2015. If Elias was built on secrets, then the foundation of her own captivity was surely buried somewhere in this room. She began to search the desk, not with the frantic energy of a prisoner, but with the calculated precision of someone who had learned from a master. She checked the undersides of the drawers, the hollow spaces in the legs, and finally, a small, nearly invisible seam in the back of the central compartment. Using a silver letter opener, she pried it open. With a soft click, a narrow drawer slid out. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger, its edges frayed and its cover stained with something dark that Clara didn't want to identify. She opened the book, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was a meticulous record of debts, names, and settlements. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning for one name in particular. She found it halfway through the book. Julian. Project Southwark. £50,000. But as she read the entries surrounding her brother's name, her blood turned to ice. Julian hadn't just lost the money at a high-stakes table. According to the notes written in a sharp, unfamiliar hand, the losses had been engineered. A man named Silas, one of Elias's most trusted captains, had been instructed to lure Julian into the games, provide him with credit he couldn't afford, and ensure the house always won. It wasn't a gamble, it was a harvest. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Julian had been a pawn used to get to her, or perhaps to create a leverage point that Elias could use for some larger play. The debt that had redefined her life, the fear that had kept her awake at night, and the slow, agonizing surrender of her body to the man who claimed to own her. It was all based on a calculated lie. Looking for something, Clara? The voice was like a gunshot in the silent room. Clara gasped, her fingers tightening on the edges of the ledger. She didn't have to turn around to know he was there. The air in the room had already shifted, becoming thick with the scent of rain, expensive tobacco, and the cold metallic tang of the city. Elias stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hallway. He was wearing a long black wool coat that was damp with sleet, and his eyes were like two pieces of flint. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was infinitely more terrifying. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Clara didn't try to hide the ledger. She stood her ground, even as her legs began to tremble. "You framed him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You didn't just collect a debt, Elias. You created one." Elias stopped just inches away. He reached out and took the ledger from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact, usually a source of confusing heat, now felt like a brand. He closed the book and tossed it onto the desk as if it were a piece of trash. "I didn't frame him, Clara," Elias said, his voice a low, rough rumble. He stepped closer, forcing her to back up against the desk. He placed his hands on either side of her, his large frame casting a shadow that swallowed her whole. "I simply allowed a situation to develop that would bring you to me. You ruined his life. You ruined mine." She tried to push him away, her hands landing on the damp wool of his coat. It was like trying to move a mountain. Elias didn't flinch. Instead, he grabbed her wrists, his grip firm but not painful, and pinned them to the desk behind her. He leaned in, his face so close she could feel the coldness of his skin and the heat of his breath. The physical proximity was overwhelming, a suffocating blend of anger and the magnetic pull that always existed between them. "Julian was ruining his life long before I met him," Elias murmured, his eyes searching hers with a dark, burning intensity. He moved one hand from her wrist to the side of her neck, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse in her throat. "He was a weak man looking for an easy way out. I just provided the door." "And what about me?" she breathed, her chest heaving as she struggled for air. "Am I just another debt to be settled?" Elias leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. The contact was electric, a slow, deliberate graze that made a traitorous shiver run down her spine. He moved his hand from her neck to her waist, his fingers splaying across her hip, pulling her flush against the hard, uncompromising line of his body. Through the layers of his coat and her sweater, the heat of him was a physical force, a reminder of the night of the storm. "You are the only thing in this world that isn't a transaction, Clara," he whispered, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous thread. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his stubble grazing her sensitive skin. "I told you I would fill every centimeter of your life. Did you think I would leave your brother's messes to chance?" He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hand sliding down to the curve of her backside, holding her firmly against him. The intimacy was jarring, a bold reclamation in the wake of her discovery. He looked at her lips, his gaze darkening with a hunger that seemed to grow with every passing second. "You found the secret," he said, his thumb dragging across her lower lip, pulling it down to reveal the pink of her inner mouth. "Now you have to decide what to do with it. You can hate me for the lie, or you can realize that you are safer in this house than you have ever been in your life." He leaned in, his nose brushing against hers. The scent of him, masculine, spice-heavy and raw, filled her senses. "I have killed men for less than what is written in that book, Clara. But for you, I would burn the whole city to the ground just to keep you standing in this room." He didn't kiss her. He let go of her wrists and stepped back, the sudden absence of his heat making the room feel like an icebox. He picked up the ledger and walked toward the fireplace, throwing the book into the dying embers. Within seconds, the leather curled and the pages began to blacken, the evidence of the frame-up turning to ash. "Silas is dead," Elias said casually, as if he were talking about the weather. "He thought he could use Julian to create a side business without my permission." He was mistaken. Clara watched the flames, her mind reeling. Elias hadn't just saved her from a debt. He had cleared the board of everyone who knew the truth. She looked at him and saw a man who was capable of terrifying cruelty and a strange, possessive kind of love. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Elias said, walking back toward her and reaching for the handgun on the desk. "We prepare for the bridge boys. They think I'm distracted by you. I want to show them that having something worth protecting only makes a man more dangerous." He handed her the weapon, his hand lingering over hers as their fingers intertwined on the cold steel. The touch was a promise and a threat, a reminder that in his world there was no such thing as a clean break. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the door. "And Clara, don't go looking for more secrets. You've already found the only one that matters." He left the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the silence. Clara looked at the fire, then at the gun in her hand. The transition was complete. She was no longer just a victim of a debt. She was a partner in a war she was only beginning to understand, and the man she should have hated was the only one standing between her and the shadows outside. The evening of February 14th, 2024, was draped in a cold, biting fog that rolled off the Thames and settled into the crevices of Mayfair's limestone facades. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. Clara stood before the full-length mirror in the East Suite, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The black dress Elias had chosen was a masterpiece of subversion, floor-length silk that moved like liquid shadow, with a back that dipped dangerously low, exposing the pale, smooth expanse of her skin. She had pinned her hair up, leaving a few stray tendrils to frame her face, and as she reached for a pair of silver earrings, the bedroom door opened. Elias stepped inside, already dressed in a tuxedo that made him look like a dark god of industry. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood by the door, his gaze dragging slowly from the hem of her gown up to her eyes. The silence was heavy, charged with the memory of the burned ledger and the secrets they now shared. "You look like a queen waiting for a war," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing on the polished wood. He stopped behind her, his reflection looming over hers in the glass. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a necklace, a single teardrop-shaped emerald suspended on a platinum chain. He leaned in, his chest pressing against her bare back. The contrast between the cool silk of her dress and the searing heat of his body made Clara's breath hitch. "The bridge boys will be there tonight," he whispered against the shell of her ear, his hands moving to fasten the clasp. His fingers were large and calloused, yet they moved with a terrifyingly gentle precision against the sensitive skin of her neck. "Along with every man who thinks he can take what belongs to me. We are going to give them a show they won't forget." He finished with the necklace and let his hands linger on her shoulders. His thumbs traced the line of her collarbone, a slow, possessive motion that sent a wave of heat through her core. "They need to see you are mine," he murmured, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. "Not because of a debt, but because I have decided it is so. Can you play the part, Clara? Can you look at me as if you would burn for me?" Clara looked at him, seeing the predator and the protector entwined in a single man. "I don't think I'll have to act as much as you think," she whispered. The gala was held at a private gallery in St. James, a space of soaring ceilings and priceless art that tonight served as a neutral ground for the city's most dangerous players. As they stepped out of the black sedan, a swarm of photographers, vultures on the payroll of the underworld, flashed their lights. Elias didn't flinch. He placed his hand firmly on the small of Clara's back, his fingers splaying across the exposed skin of her spine. The touch was a brand, a public declaration of ownership that made her feel both anchored and exposed. Inside the room was a blur of diamonds, champagne, and whispered threats. Elias moved through the crowd with a predator's grace, his hand never leaving her. He introduced her to men with cold eyes and women with sharpened smiles, his voice always dripping with a dark, protective pride. "Clara is the only thing in this city that isn't for sale," he told a rival boss from the north, his arm sliding around her waist to pull her hip flush against his. He leaned down and kissed her temple, a gesture that looked tender to the crowd, but felt like a claim to Clara. The physical contact throughout the night was relentless. Every time they stopped to speak, Elias found a way to remind her, and everyone watching, of his proximity. He whispered instructions into her ear, his lips grazing her skin. He draped his jacket over her shoulders when the air grew cold, his scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloping her. As the night wore on, they moved toward a secluded balcony overlooking the main hall. The music was a distant thrum, and the fog outside pressed against the glass. Elias turned her to face him, his hands coming up to cradle her face. The candlelight from the gallery caught the amber flecks in his eyes, making them burn with an intensity that made Clara's knees weak. "There is a man near the bar," Elias whispered, his thumbs dragging across her cheekbones. "Grey suit, red tie. That is Miller. He's been talking to the bridge boys. He thinks I don't know he's the one who gave them your brother's location." Clara felt a surge of cold fury, but Elias didn't let her move. He stepped closer, his body shielding her from view as he pressed her against the stone railing. The intimacy was jarring, a bold display of affection that blurred the lines of their performance. He leaned in, his nose brushing against hers, his breath hot against her lips. "We need him to think we are distracted," Elias murmured. "Give him the show, Clara." He captured her mouth in a kiss that was deep, desperate, and entirely too real. It wasn't the kiss of a man playing a part. It was the kiss of a man who was starving. Clara responded instinctively, her hands sliding up his chest to tangle in his hair. The physical details were overwhelming. The taste of vintage wine, the rough texture of his tongue, and the crushing weight of his body against hers. For a moment, the gala, the traitor, and the war disappeared. There was only the heat of him, the way his hands moved down to her hips to pull her harder against his tuxedo-clad frame. Every centimeter of her felt alive, vibrating with a forbidden desire that she could no longer deny. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. "He's moving," Elias breathed, his voice thick with a hunger that had nothing to do with Miller. "He thinks he's safe because I'm lost in you." "Are you?" Clara whispered, her heart hammering. Elias looked at her, and for a fleeting second the mask of the gangster slipped. "More than I should be." He let go of her, the sudden coldness of the night air making her shiver. He adjusted his cuffs, his expression returning to its usual calculated stone. "Stay here. Don't move until I come back for you. The game is almost over." He walked away, disappearing into the crowd toward Miller. Clara stood on the balcony, her skin still humming from his touch, watching the room below. She saw Elias approach the man in the grey suit. They spoke for a moment, Elias leaning in close, a shark-like smile on his face. But as Elias led Miller toward a side exit, Clara noticed something else. Two men she recognized from the Southwark docks, members of the Bridge Boys, were moving in the opposite direction toward the balcony. They weren't looking for Elias. They were looking for her. The trap hadn't just been for the traitor. It had been for her all along. Clara reached for the small clutch bag where she had hidden the silver letter opener from the library, her fingers trembling. The performance was over, and the real fight for survival was about to begin in the shadows of the gallery. The shadows of the gallery seemed to stretch and distort as the two men from the Bridge Boys closed the distance. It was February 14th, 2024, and the cold air on the balcony felt like a premonition. Clara's fingers closed around the cold, sharp handle of the silver letter opener inside her clutch. Her heart was a drum in her ears, a frantic, rhythmic thrumming that drowned out the distant, muffled swells of the orchestral music from the ballroom. Elias was gone, swallowed by the crowd in his pursuit of Miller. He had left her here thinking she was a safe spectator in a game he had already won. He was wrong. The first man, a thick-set individual with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, stepped into the light of the single candle flickering on a nearby bistro table. He didn't look like a gala guest. He looked like a butcher dressed in silk. "Mr. Elias is occupied," the man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "He won't be coming back for you tonight, Clara." "Stay back," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. She took a step toward the glass doors, but the second man, taller and leaner, shifted to block her path. "Don't make this difficult," the lean one murmured. "The boss wants you intact, for now." Clara didn't wait for them to move. She lunged toward the tall one, the letter opener hidden against her palm. She wasn't a fighter, but she was a survivor who had been trained by a man who saw the world as a battlefield. As the lean man reached for her arm, she swung, the silver tip catching the fabric of his expensive suit and grazing the skin of his forearm. He hissed in pain, grabbing his arm, but the distraction was momentary. The larger man was on her in an instant. He didn't strike her. Instead, he wrapped a massive tree-trunk arm around her waist, lifting her off her feet. The physical contact was jarring and brutal. Clara felt the air leave her lungs as she was pressed against his hard, unforgiving chest. The scent of him, stale beer and cheap grease, was a sickening contrast to the sophisticated elegance of the gallery. "Let go of me," she gasped, kicking out, her heels clicking uselessly against his shins. "Easy now," the man grunted. He pinned her arms to her sides, his grip so tight she felt the delicate silk of her dress begin to strain. He dragged her toward the service stairs at the far end of the balcony, away from the eyes of the high society vultures. Just as they reached the heavy steel door, it swung open. Clara felt a surge of hope, expecting to see Elias's dark, commanding silhouette. Instead, she saw Marcus. Marcus had been Elias's shadow for 3 years. He was the man who drove the car, the man who stood at the gate of the estate, the man Elias trusted with his life. He looked at Clara, his expression a mask of cold, professional indifference. "Marcus, help me!" Clara cried out. Marcus didn't move to help her. He reached out and took her clutch from her hand, tossing the silver letter opener into the shadows of the stairwell. He looked at the two Bridge Boys and nodded. "The car is in the alley," Marcus said, his voice flat. "Move quickly." Elias is already realizing Miller was just the bait. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, heavier than the man holding her. Marcus had been the one who watched them in the library. He was the one who knew every secret of the estate. He wasn't just a guard, he was the leak. The two men dragged Clara down the narrow, dimly lit service stairs. Every step was a blur of motion and terror. When they reached the bottom, the cold, damp air of the back alley hit her like a slap. A nondescript van was waiting, its engine idling with a low, predatory growl. The large man shoved her toward the open sliding door. Clara scrambled back, her hands scraping against the wet pavement. She tried to scream, but Marcus was there, his hand coming down over her mouth. His palm was calloused and smelled of gun oil, a sensation that triggered a flash of memory. Elias teaching her to hold the handgun in the library. "Don't," Marcus whispered in her ear. The proximity was suffocating, his chest pressing against her back as he forced her into the van. "If you stay quiet, you might live long enough for Elias to see what happens when he loses focus." The physical struggle was intense. Clara fought with everything she had, her body twisting and turning against Marcus's ironclad grip. For a moment, they were locked in a desperate, intimate struggle on the floor of the van. She could feel the strength in his limbs, the heat of his breath and the absolute lack of mercy in his touch. He pinned her wrists above her head with one hand, his other hand still muffling her cries. "He loves you, you know," Marcus murmured, a dark, twisted amusement in his voice. "A man like Elias, he shouldn't love anything. It makes him slow. It makes him weak. And that's why you're going to be the end of him." The sliding door slammed shut, plunging the interior into a suffocating darkness. The van lurched forward, tires screeching against the wet cobbles as it disappeared into the thick London fog. Upstairs, on the balcony, the silence was absolute. The single candle had finally flickered out. Elias stepped through the glass doors, his tuxedo jacket gone, his white shirt stained with a spray of blood that wasn't his. He had dealt with Miller, and he had dealt with the men Miller had brought. He was breathing hard, his eyes scanning the empty space with a growing, frantic intensity. "Clara?" he called out, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He walked toward the railing, his boots clicking on the stone. He saw it then. Lying on the floor, near the bistro table, was the emerald necklace. The platinum chain was broken, the green stone catching the faint light from the ballroom like a dying star. Elias knelt and picked it up. He closed his hand over the emerald, the sharp edges of the broken chain digging into his palm until blood began to seep between his fingers. He didn't flinch. He looked toward the service door, his face twisting into a mask of cold, calculated rage. The predator was back, but this time he wasn't hunting for territory or respect. He was hunting for the only thing in the world that had made him feel human. He stood up, the broken necklace still clutched in his bleeding hand. He didn't call for his men. He didn't call for Marcus. He knew. The silence of the balcony told him everything he needed to know about the depth of the betrayal. He walked toward the exit, his shadow long and jagged against the gallery walls. The bridge boys thought they had taken his weakness. They were about to find out that they had only unleashed his most terrifying strength. The hunt had begun. The air in the warehouse was a thick, stagnant soup of industrial grease, river rot, and the metallic tang of old rust. It was February 15th, 2024, and the world beyond these corrugated iron walls felt like a distant, faded memory. Clara was bound to a heavy wooden chair in the center of a wide, dimly lit floor, her wrists chafed raw by the abrasive bite of thick hemp rope. The emerald silk of her gala dress was torn at the hem, a jagged reminder of the struggle in the van, and the cold was a persistent, gnawing beast that had long since numbed her toes and fingers. Across from her, Marcus sat on an upturned crate, cleaning a silver pocket knife with a piece of cloth. He didn't look like a traitor. He looked like a man doing a tedious chore. "He's coming, you know," Clara whispered, her voice a dry rasp that hurt her throat. Marcus didn't look up. "I'm counting on it. Elias is a creature of habit. He thinks with his pride, and now he thinks with whatever he feels for you. That makes him predictable, and predictable men end up in the river." Suddenly, the heavy rolling door at the far end of the warehouse didn't just open. It exploded inward. The sound was a deafening crack of tortured metal, followed by the high-pitched scream of tires on concrete. A black SUV tore through the opening, its headlights cutting through the gloom like twin searchlights. Clara squinted against the glare, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop, the driver's side door swung open. Elias emerged not as a man but as a force of nature. He wasn't wearing his tuxedo jacket or his tie. His white shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked as if they had been forged from iron. In his hand, he held a shotgun with a shortened barrel, and his face was a mask of such absolute, terrifying calm that even Marcus stood up, his pocket knife forgotten. The shadows around the warehouse erupted. 4 men from the bridge boys stepped out from behind the crates, weapons raised. The first one didn't even have time to aim. Elias fired, the roar of the shotgun echoing like a cannon blast in the confined space. The man was thrown back as if by an invisible giant. Elias didn't seek cover. He walked forward with a slow, rhythmic pace, firing and reloading with a mechanical precision that was chilling to behold. He moved through the crossfire as if the bullets were beneath his notice, his eyes fixed entirely on the center of the room, on her. "Marcus!" one of the gunmen shouted, but Marcus was already moving toward Clara. He grabbed a handful of her hair, pulling her head back and pressing the blade of his pocket knife against the soft skin of her throat. "Stop!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking for the first time. "Stop, or she dies right here." Elias halted 10 paces away. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and the low, guttering sound of the SUV's engine. Elias lowered the shotgun, his gaze moving from Marcus to the blade against Clara's neck. His eyes were dark, bottomless pits of promise. "You were a good soldier, Marcus," Elias said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "But you made one mistake. You thought you could use her to negotiate." "I have the knife, Elias. I have the leverage." "You have nothing," Elias replied. In a movement too fast for the eye to follow, he dropped the shotgun and pulled a small concealed pistol from his waistband. The shot was a single, sharp crack. Marcus's eyes went wide, a small red bloom appearing exactly in the center of his forehead. He slumped back, the knife sliding harmlessly from Clara's throat as he hit the concrete with a dull thud. Elias was at her side in 3 strides. He didn't check the bodies. He didn't look for more enemies. He fell to his knees in front of her, his large hands trembling as they reached for her face. "Clara," he breathed, his voice breaking. He pulled the knife from the floor and sliced through her bonds with a single violent motion. The moment she was free, Clara collapsed forward, her strength utterly spent. Elias caught her, his arms wrapping around her with a desperate, crushing intensity. The physical contact was an explosion of sensation. The heat of his skin, the rough texture of his shirt, and the overwhelming scent of him, smoke, rain, and the raw, metallic tang of adrenaline. "I've got you," he whispered, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "I've got you." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands splaying across her cheeks, his thumbs tracing the dark circles under her eyes. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving against hers. He leaned in and kissed her, a raw, bruising collision of lips and teeth that tasted of salt and survival. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a reclamation, a desperate attempt to prove to both of them that they were still alive. Clara's hands found their way to his chest, her fingers clutching the damp fabric of his shirt. She could feel the erratic, powerful thrum of his heart, a mirror to her own. The heat radiating from him was intoxicating, a fire that finally drove the winter chill from her bones. She leaned into him, her body molding to the hard, uncompromising lines of his torso. "You came," she whispered against his lips. "I would have burned this city to the ground to find you," he murmured, his voice thick with a vulnerability that was far more intimate than any touch. He slid one hand down to the small of her back, his fingers pressing into her skin through the torn silk of her dress, while his other hand tangled in her hair, pulling her head back so he could see her eyes. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. He leaned down, his lips grazing the sensitive skin of her shoulder, his breath hot and ragged. "Every centimeter," he whispered, his voice a ghost of the promise he had made in the alley. "I told you. I don't let go of what is mine." He picked her up, his movements effortless despite the chaos around them. He carried her to the SUV, his grip possessive and unyielding. As he placed her in the passenger seat, he leaned in, his body hovering over hers for a long, heavy second. He didn't say anything, but the way his gaze lingered on her mouth and the way his hand remained on her thigh spoke of a hunger that had only been sharpened by the fear of losing her. He got into the driver's seat and slammed the door, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse. As they tore away from the scene of the carnage, the first light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the London sky, a pale, cold grey that promised nothing but a new kind of war. Clara looked at the man beside her, his profile carved from shadow and resolve. She knew then that the rescue wasn't an end. It was a baptism. They were no longer prisoner and captor, or even just allies. They were two parts of a single violent whole, and the world was about to find out exactly what happens when a monster finds something he loves more than his own power. The safe house was miles away, but as Elias reached over and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a grip that felt like a permanent vow, Clara realized she had never been more certain of where she belonged. The debt was gone, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. a devotion that knew no limits. The safe house was a modest, weathered cottage, tucked away on the fog-drenched outskirts of Epping Forest, far from the prying eyes of the Southwark docks. It was February 15th, 2024, and as the SUV pulled into the gravel drive, the morning light remained a bruised, sickly grey. The architecture was simple, dark timber and local stone, but to Clara it looked like a fortress. Elias didn't wait for her to move. He was around the car in an instant, opening the door and lifting her into his arms. His strength was a constant grounding force. He carried her inside, through a small kitchen that smelled of dried lavender and old wood, and into a bedroom where a fire was already laid in the hearth. He set her down on the edge of the bed, with a tenderness that felt almost alien, coming from a man who had just dismantled an entire warehouse of enemies. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He returned a moment later with a bowl of warm water, clean cloths and a first aid kit. He knelt between her knees, his large frame filling the space, and began to work. The silence between them was thick, weighted with the echoes of gunfire and the unspoken terror of the last few hours. Elias reached out, his fingers steady as he took her wrists. The sight of the raw, red welts left by the hemp ropes made his jaw tighten so hard, Clara heard the bone click. He dipped a cloth into the water and began to wash the grime and blood from her skin. The contact was searingly intimate. His hands were huge, his skin slightly rough and calloused, but his touch was light, almost reverent. "I thought I had lost you," he murmured, his eyes fixed on his task. For the first time he didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and seen his own end. "I knew you would come," Clara replied, her voice trembling. "I kept telling Marcus, I knew." Elias stopped his movements. He looked up, his dark eyes searching hers. The intensity was a physical weight. He reached up, his thumb tracing the faint bruise on her jaw where Marcus had held her. The heat from his hand seeped into her skin, a slow, intoxicating fire that chased away the lingering chill of the warehouse. "I have spent my life building walls, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a rough, vulnerable whisper. "I thought if I had enough power, enough money, I would never be afraid again. But tonight, when I saw that knife at your throat, I realized that I am more fragile now than I ever was in that auto repair shop." He moved his hand from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the stray hairs that had escaped her pins. He pulled her forward until their foreheads were resting against each other. Clara could feel the erratic, heavy thud of his heart against her own chest. The physical proximity was overwhelming, a suffocating blend of relief and a hunger that had been sharpened by the threat of death. "You're not fragile, Elias," she whispered, her hands finding their way to his shoulders, clutching the damp, blood-stained fabric of his shirt. "I am when it comes to you," he replied. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't the bruising, desperate reclamation of the warehouse. This was slow, a deliberate exploration of skin and breath. It tasted of salt and wood smoke. Clara felt a wave of heat wash over her, a heavy, liquid sensation that made her lean into him, her body molding to the hard, uncompromising lines of his torso. Elias stood, pulling her up with him. His hands moved with a feverish intensity, sliding under the torn emerald silk of her dress. His palms were hot against the small of her back, his fingers splaying across her skin as he pulled her flush against his hip. The contact was total, a detailed map of muscle and heat. Through the thin layers of their clothes, she could feel every contour of his body, the powerful thighs, the broad chest, and the raw, unyielding need that radiated from him. He began to work the zipper of her dress, his movements methodical and focused. As the silk pooled at her feet, leaving her in her lace undergarments, the firelight danced across her skin, casting long, wavering shadows. Elias didn't look away. His gaze was a claim, a silent vow that he would never let her go again. He stripped off his shirt, revealing a torso carved from hard work and violence. There were scars, a jagged line across his ribs, a puckered mark on his shoulder that Clara had never seen before. She reached out, her fingers tracing the map of his survival. The skin was hot, vibrating with the life that had nearly been snuffed out. "Every centimeter," Elias breathed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He picked her up again, laying her back against the cool sheets. He followed her down, his heavy weight a comforting pressure. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his stubble grazing her sensitive skin, his breath hot and ragged against her pulse point. He moved his hand from her waist to her thigh, his thumb tracing the line of her skin with a slow, rhythmic motion that made her breath hitch. The intimacy was raw and overwhelming, a celebration of the fact that they were still breathing. Every touch was a question and an answer, a desperate attempt to erase the memory of the warehouse with the reality of their connection. Elias moved with a predatory grace, his lips finding every sensitive spot, his hands claiming her with a possessive, unyielding strength. Clara felt her world narrowed down to this room, this fire, and this man. The fear of the Bridge Boys and the memory of Marcus's betrayal were pushed to the periphery, replaced by the magnetic, terrifying pull of the gangster who had become her world. Hours later, as the fire died down to a low orange glow, they lay tangled together under the heavy quilts. The silence of the forest outside was absolute. Elias held her close, his arm a heavy, protective bar across her waist, his chin resting on the top of her head. "We can't stay here forever," Clara whispered, her eyes fixed on the dying embers. "I know," Elias replied, his voice thick with the remnants of their passion. "The city is still waiting, and there are still debts to be settled." He tightened his grip on her, his fingers pressing into her hip. "But for tonight there is no city. There is only this." He leaned down and kissed the top of her shoulder, his breath warm against her skin. But even as Clara drifted toward a dreamless sleep, she saw the shadow of a doubt in his eyes. The rescue had changed them, but it hadn't solved the problem of who Elias was. He was still a man who lived by the sword, and Clara knew that the peace of the cottage was only a temporary sanctuary. Behind his calm facade, she could feel the gears turning. He had the traitor's blood on his hands, but the man who had truly orchestrated the betrayal was still out there. And Elias, she realized, would not be satisfied until the debt was paid in full, not with money, but with the kind of justice that only a man like him could deliver. The war wasn't over. It was just changing shape. The transition from the silence of Epping Forest to the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of London was jarring. It was February 17th, 2024, and a biting sleet was beginning to fall, turning the pavement into a grey, treacherous mirror. They had returned to the city under the cover of a moonless sky, moving into a high-rise apartment that overlooked the serpentine curve of the Thames. Here, the walls were glass and steel, a stark contrast to the rustic sanctuary they had left behind. Elias had been on the phone for 3 hours, his voice a low rhythmic drone of commands and calculations. The man who had orchestrated the frame-up, the man who had nearly cost Clara her life and had definitely ruined Julian's, was no longer a ghost. His name was Arthur Vance, a high-ranking member of the Bridge Boys who had survived Elias's warehouse purge. "We have him," Elias said, ending the call and tossing his phone onto the leather sofa. He walked toward Clara, who was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the lights of the city flicker in the storm. He was dressed in black again, a charcoal wool coat over a dark sweater, looking every bit the king who had returned to claim his throne. He stopped behind her, his chest pressing against her back, his hands sliding around her waist to pull her flush against him. The physical contact was immediate and intense. Clara leaned back into him, her head resting on his shoulder. Even through the layers of their clothes, she could feel the hard, uncompromising lines of his body and the radiating heat that seemed to be his alone. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply, his breath warm against the sensitive skin of her neck. "He's at a private club in Bermondsey," Elias murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I'm going there now. I want you to come with me." Clara stiffened. "Why? Why do you want me to see this?" Elias turned her around in his arms, his hands splaying across her lower back to hold her close. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of cold resolve and a terrifyingly raw vulnerability. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip, a slow possessive motion that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "Because you found the secret in the ledger," he whispered. "You saw the lie that brought us together. I want you to see the end of it. I want you to decide his fate." "Elias, I'm not a judge," she breathed, her hands clutching the lapels of his coat. "In my world you are," he replied. He leaned down, his lips grazing hers in a ghost of a kiss that tasted of iron and smoke. He moved his hand from her back to her jaw, his fingers tangling in her hair. "You can choose justice, or you can choose mercy, but whatever you choose, you will know the weight of it." The drive to Bermondsey was silent. The city felt smaller, as if the buildings were leaning in to watch the final act. They arrived at a nondescript brick building that looked like a warehouse, but housed one of the most exclusive illegal gambling dens in the city. Elias's men were already there, standing like shadows in the rain. They entered through a side door. The air inside was thick with expensive cigars and the sharp metallic tang of fear. In a back room tied to a heavy steel chair sat Arthur Vance. He was older than Clara expected, with thinning hair and eyes that darted frantically around the room. He was bloodied but conscious, his face a map of the violence that had led him here. Elias walked toward him with a slow, predatory grace. He didn't look at the man's wounds, he looked at him as if he were a piece of unfinished business. He pulled a second chair over and sat directly in front of him, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "Arthur," Elias said softly. The name sounded like a death sentence in the quiet room. "You remember Clara, don't you? The woman you used to try and break me." Vance looked at Clara, his eyes wide with terror. "It was business, Elias, just business. Silas said—" "Silas is dead," Elias interrupted, his voice a silken, dangerous thread. "And Silas wasn't the one who gave the order to pull the trigger in the warehouse. That was you." Elias stood up and walked back to Clara. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, silver-plated handgun. He took her hand, his palm broad and warm, and pressed the cold steel of the weapon into her fingers. He moved behind her, his chest pressing against her spine, his large hands covering hers to steady the weight. The physical intimacy in this room of death was jarring. Clara felt the strength in his arms, the steady expansion of his chest as he breathed, and the overwhelming heat of his body. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a low rumble that seemed to travel through her bones. "He framed your brother," Elias whispered. "He turned your life into a tragedy just to see if he could steal a few docks from me. He would have watched you die without blinking." Clara felt the weight of the gun, and more importantly, the weight of Elias's expectation. She looked at Vance, who was weeping now, a pathetic sound that filled the small space. She thought of Julian, of the fear that had defined her life for months, and of the man holding her now, a man who was offering her a piece of his darkness as a gift. "Do it, Clara," Elias murmured, his fingers tightening on hers, his thumb grazing her knuckle. "Close the debt, permanently." The physical details were sharp. The smell of gun oil, the rough texture of Elias's sweater against her cheek, and the way his heart was beating with a slow, rhythmic power. She could feel his desire for her to pull the trigger, to finally become a part of his world in the most irrevocable way. Clara's finger traced the curve of the trigger. She looked into Vance's eyes and saw nothing but a void. Then she looked up at Elias's reflection in a darkened window. She saw the monster he had become to survive, and the man she had held in the cottage in Epping Forest. "No," she whispered, her voice steady. She lowered the gun, her hand trembling. Elias didn't let go immediately. He held her there for a long, heavy second, his body pressed so tightly against hers she could feel every muscle. Then he slowly took the weapon from her hand and tucked it back into his coat. "Why?" he asked, his voice thick with a confusing mix of frustration and something that sounded like relief. "Because if I do this, there's nothing left of the woman you wanted to protect," Clara said, turning to face him. She reached up and placed her hands on his cheeks, her thumbs tracing the hard lines of his jaw. "If I become like you, Elias, then the Bridge Boys have already won. They've taken everything." Elias looked at her, the amber flecks in his eyes burning with an intense, raw emotion. He reached out and grabbed her waist, pulling her flush against him with a violent, desperate hunger. He kissed her, a deep, bruising collision of lips and breath that felt like a battle. It was a kiss of frustration, of passion, and of a man who was realizing that the woman he owned was the only thing he couldn't control. "Take him to the precinct," Elias commanded his men, never breaking eye contact with Clara. Give them the evidence of the warehouse murders. Let the law take what's left of him. As they walked out of the club and back into the London sleet, the tension between them was a physical presence. Elias led her to the car, his hand heavy and possessive on the small of her back. He didn't speak until they were back in the high-rise, the city lights reflecting in the glass like distant diamonds. He trapped her against the window, his hands pinning her wrists above her head. The physical contact was total, his hard torso pressing her against the cool glass. He leaned down, his nose brushing hers, his breath hot and ragged. "You think you saved my soul tonight, Clara?" he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I think I saved us," she replied. Elias looked at her for a long minute, his gaze traveling from her eyes to her mouth. He let go of her wrists and slid his hands down to her hips, pulling her harder against him. The hunger in his touch was undeniable, a raw, unyielding need that had been sharpened by the moral crossroads they had just crossed. "The war isn't over," he murmured, his lips grazing her jawline. "The bridge boys won't stop because one man is in a cell. They will come for me, and they will come for you." He leaned in, his voice a ghost of a promise against her skin. "But I told you, every centimeter. I'm not letting you go, Clara. Not to the law, and certainly not to the shadows." As he buried his face in the crook of her neck, Clara looked out at the city and realized that while she had chosen mercy, the path ahead was still paved with blood. Elias was a king under siege, and she was now the crown he was willing to die for. The moral dilemma had been settled, but the final sacrifice was looming on the horizon, and the cost would be higher than either of them could imagine. Chapter 12 is concluded. Clara chose mercy, but the threat from the bridge boys is far from over. Did you like the tension of the confrontation, or would you like to adjust her decision? Shall we move to Chapter 13? The Final Sacrifice. The morning of February 19th, 2024, arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, hanging low and heavy over the jagged silhouette of the city. Inside the glass-walled high-rise, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen against thick, cream-colored parchment. Elias sat at a minimalist desk, his shoulders hunched, looking like a man carrying the weight of the entire world. He was signing away the docks. One by one, the territories he had bled for. The warehouses in the east, the distribution hubs near the river, the silent stakes in the city's underground markets, were being transferred to a trust that would eventually be liquidated. It was the ultimate retreat. To the underworld it would look like a surrender. To Elias it was the only way to buy a future where Clara didn't have to look over her shoulder every time the wind rattled a window. Clara stood in the doorway watching him. She was wearing a soft, oversized cashmere sweater that reached mid-thigh, her hair loose and tumbling over her shoulders. The sight of him, so focused and so burdened, pulled at something deep inside her. "You don't have to do this, Elias," she whispered. Elias stopped writing but didn't look up. He set the pen down, his large, calloused hand trembling slightly as he rubbed his face. "I told you, Clara. The bridge boys won't stop as long as I am the King of Suffolk. If I have nothing they want, they have no reason to come for us. You're giving up everything you are," she said, walking into the room. Her footsteps were silent on the polished floor. Elias finally turned. He stood up, his presence immediately filling the space, his charcoal shirt strained across his broad chest. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped just inches away, the heat of his body acting like a magnetic pull she couldn't resist. He reached out, his hand sliding into her hair, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a devastatingly gentle pressure. "I am not giving up who I am," he murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration that settled in her chest. "I am giving up what I do. There is a difference." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of him, expensive tobacco, sandalwood, and a faint hint of the cold morning air enveloped her. He moved his other hand to her waist, his fingers splaying across the small of her back, pulling her flush against the hard, uncompromising line of his body. Through the soft cashmere, she could feel every muscle in his torso, the steady, powerful thrum of his heart, and the raw intensity of his focus. "I spent 15 years building a fortress," he whispered against her lips. "I thought it was to keep me safe, But then you walked into that alley, and I realized I was just building a cage. I want to be free, Clara. I want us to be free." He kissed her then, a slow, lingering exploration that tasted of sacrifice and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was a kiss that spoke of a new life, away from the blood and the shadows. Clara responded with equal intensity, her hands sliding up his chest to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer as if she could shield him from the world he was leaving behind. The physical contact was deep and intimate. Elias moved his hand from her waist to the curve of her hip, his grip possessive and unyielding. He backed her toward the large window, the city lights below blurred by the morning mist. He pressed her against the glass, the cool surface a sharp contrast to the searing heat of his skin. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her pulse point. "I love you," he breathed, the words sounding like a confession of a crime. Clara felt a tear slip down her cheek. "I love you too, Elias." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she had never seen there before. "The transfers will be complete by noon. Then we leave. There's a boat waiting in the estuary. We'll go where the fog can't find us." But the peace of the high-rise was a fragile thing, a glass bubble waiting to be shattered. Suddenly a sharp metallic ping echoed through the room, the sound of a silenced round punching through the reinforced glass of the balcony door. Then another. The glass didn't shatter, but the spiderweb of cracks was a terrifying omen. "Get down!" Elias roared, his protective instincts overriding everything else in an instant. He tackled her to the floor, his heavy weight a shield over her body. The air was suddenly filled with the high-pitched whine of more rounds striking the furniture and the walls. The bridge boys hadn't waited for the noon deadline. They had seen the movement of assets, realized their window of opportunity was closing, and decided to take by force what Elias was trying to give away. "Stay here, don't move," Elias commanded, sliding across the floor to the desk where his hidden cache of weapons was kept. He pulled out a tactical vest and a submachine gun, his movements mechanical and terrifyingly efficient. The man from the warehouse was back, the predator who knew only how to survive. He checked the monitors on his desk. The security feed showed a dozen men in tactical gear entering the lobby, moving with the precision of a military unit. "They're through the first perimeter," Elias muttered, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. He looked at Clara, who was huddled near the sofa, her eyes wide with terror. He felt a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. He had tried to give them everything, had tried to walk away in peace, and they had chosen to hunt him in his own home. He moved back to her, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the reinforced panic room hidden behind the library shelves. "You get inside, and you lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. Do you hear me?" "Elias, no, come with me," she cried, clutching his arm. "I have to hold them at the elevator," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He leaned in and kissed her one last time, a hard, fast collision of lips that tasted of gunpowder and finality. "If I don't stop them there, the panic room won't matter. They brought thermite, Clara. They aren't here to kidnap you this time. They're here to end it." He shoved her into the small, steel-lined room and hit the closing mechanism. As the heavy door slid shut, the last thing Clara saw was Elias standing in the center of the library, his weapon raised, his eyes burning with a cold, absolute light. Outside, the elevator chimed. The sound of the doors opening was followed by an explosion that rocked the entire floor. Elias didn't flinch. He stepped into the hallway, the submachine gun stuttering in his hands as he met the first wave of attackers. The noise was deafening. A chaotic symphony of gunfire, shouting, and the shattering of everything Elias had built. He was a ghost in his own house, moving through the shadows he knew so well, firing with a lethal accuracy that left no room for error. But there were too many of them. He felt a sharp, burning sting in his shoulder, then another in his side. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Clara was behind that door, and as long as he breathed, no one was getting past him. He reached the foyer, the air thick with plaster dust and the smell of ozone. A flashbang went off, blinding him for a fraction of a second. In that moment, a heavy weight slammed into his chest, throwing him back against the marble pedestal of a statue. He looked up through the haze and saw him, the leader of the Bridge Boys, a man whose face was a map of old scars and new ambitions. He was holding a high-caliber pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger. Elias reached for his own weapon, but it had been knocked several feet away. He was cornered, his body screaming in pain, his blood staining the white marble floor. He looked toward the library, toward the hidden door where Clara was waiting, and a strange, cold peace settled over him. He had made his sacrifice. The rival smiled, a jagged, ugly expression, and leveled the gun at Elias's head. "The king is dead," he sneered. The sound of the shot echoed through the high-rise, a final, definitive note in the symphony of the night. While inside the panic room, Clara pressed her hands against the cold steel, waiting for a sound that would tell her if she was still a woman with a future, or a ghost mourning a man who had given up everything to save her. The smoke in the foyer was a thick, acrid curtain that tasted of ozone and spent brass. For a heartbeat, the world was silent, the kind of silence that exists only after an explosion. Inside the panic room, Clara had heard the single, sharp crack of a high-caliber round, and for 3 agonizing seconds she had forgotten how to breathe. Then the heavy steel door hissed open. She didn't wait for it to fully retract. She scrambled out into the library, her feet slipping on the scattered debris of her life. She reached the foyer and stopped dead. The leader of the Bridge Boys was no longer smiling. He was slumped against the elevator doors, a dark, symmetrical hole in the center of his chest. He hadn't been the one who fired the final shot. Clara looked to her right. Elias was still on the floor, his back against the marble pedestal, his white shirt now almost entirely crimson. His weapon lay 5 feet away, but his eyes were wide, fixed on the doorway leading to the master suite. Standing there was Clara's brother, Julian. He was trembling, a heavy service pistol held in both hands, his face pale and tear-streaked. He had come back not to pay a debt, but to find his sister, and in the chaos, he had found the one moment of courage his life had been missing. "Julian," Clara whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the ruins of the room. Julian dropped the gun, the heavy metal clattering against the marble. He looked at Elias, then at Clara, and without a word he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the back stairwell. He had cleared his own debt in the only way that mattered. Clara didn't follow him. She couldn't. She threw herself across the floor, sliding on her knees until she reached Elias. "Elias! Elias, look at me!" she cried, her hands frantic as they moved over his chest. He groaned, a low, wet sound that made her heart seize. He reached up, his large, blood-stained hand trembling as it found her face. His thumb, still warm despite the cold air pouring in through the shattered windows, traced the line of her jaw. You're still here," he rasped, his voice a jagged shadow of its former self. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere," she promised, hot tears spilling onto his skin, washing away the soot and the blood. The physical details of the next hour were a blur of siren lights and the rhythmic thrum of adrenaline. Elias had prepared for this. A private medical team, men who asked no questions and were paid in the kind of gold that bought absolute loyalty, arrived within 10 minutes. They moved with a clinical cold efficiency, stabilized him, and carried him out through the service elevator, while the local police were still blocks away, tangled in the traffic Elias's men had engineered. By the evening of February 19th, 2024, they were in a different kind of sanctuary, a private clinic disguised as a luxury hotel on the coast of Kent. The room smelled of antiseptic and the salty tang of the English Channel. Elias lay in a massive bed, his chest wrapped in thick white bandages. He was pale, his features drawn with pain, but the fire in his eyes hadn't been extinguished. Clara sat beside him, her hand intertwined with his. She had changed into a simple silk slip, the cool fabric a relief against her skin, which still felt like it was vibrating from the explosions. "The docs are gone," Elias murmured, his voice stronger now, though still rough. "Vance is in a cell. The Bridge Boys are leaderless. There is nothing left for them to fight for." "It's over," Clara whispered. Elias pulled her hand toward him, kissing her knuckles. His lips were warm, a stark contrast to the cold reality of the morning. He reached out with his other arm, pulling her toward him, until she was lying against his side, her head on his uninjured shoulder. The intimacy was raw and heavy. Clara could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart, a miracle of survival. Through the thin silk of her slip and the bandages on his chest, The heat of their bodies fused. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. "I signed the last paper before they arrived," he told her, his hand sliding down to the small of her back, his fingers splaying across her skin with a possessive, lingering pressure. "The trust is settled. Julian has enough to disappear, to start over somewhere where no one knows his name." "And us?" Clara asked, looking up at him. Elias looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him in that rain-slicked alley, there was no shadow of the predator in his gaze. There was only the man. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep resolution that tasted of salt, survival, and a quiet, terrifying peace. "We are ghosts, Clara," he whispered against her lips, "and ghosts can go wherever they want." He moved his hand from her back to her hip, pulling her hip flush against his. Even in his weakened state, the physical pull between them was an all-consuming force. He traced the curve of her body with a slow, detailed intensity, his touch a promise that the debt was truly, finally paid. "Every centimeter," he murmured, his voice a ghost of the promise that had started it all. As the moon rose over the channel, casting a silver path across the water, Elias held her with a strength that defied his injuries. The resolution was complete. The king was gone, and the woman who had been his prisoner was now the only world he had left. But as the waves crashed against the cliffs below, Clara saw a single black car pull into the clinic's driveway. No one was supposed to know they were here. She felt a familiar, cold prickle of intuition. The enemies of the past were dead, but the future they had bought with blood was already beginning to ask its own price. She didn't tell Elias. She simply held him tighter, her skin against his, as they prepared for the final dawn of their old lives. The morning of April 25th, 2024, broke over the horizon with a clarity that felt like a benediction. The air was no longer thick with the industrial grime of the docks or the suffocating tension of the high-rise. Instead, it tasted of salt, wild jasmine, and the infinite promise of the open sea. Far from the concrete labyrinth where they had first met, Elias and Clara stood on the wooden balcony of a secluded villa, watching the first light of a new world bleed across the water. Elias stood behind her, his presence a warm, solid weight that anchored her. He was no longer dressed in the sharp armored suits of a king under siege. He wore a simple white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms where the scars were fading into silver memories. His recovery had been long and grueling, but his strength had returned with a quiet, tempered intensity. He reached out, his large hands sliding around her waist to pull her flush against him. The physical contact was immediate and deep, a language they had perfected in the months of their healing. Clara leaned back into his chest, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. Through the thin fabric of her sundress, she could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his heart, the same heart that had nearly stopped for her in the ruins of the foyer. "You're quiet today," Elias murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration that sent a familiar shiver down her spine. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin, which now smelled of sunshine and peace. "I was just thinking about the alley," Clara whispered, her fingers covering his hands where they rested on her stomach. "October 14th seems like it happened in another life, to a different woman." Elias tightened his grip, his thumbs tracing the curve of her hip bones through the fabric. "It was another life. We died in that city, Clara. This is what comes after." He turned her around in his arms, his hands splaying across the small of her back to hold her close. The intensity of his gaze was no longer predatory. It was a deep, unwavering devotion that made her knees feel weak. He reached up, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck, pulling her head back just enough to look into her eyes. "I spent my life taking," he said, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous thread of honesty. "I took territory, I took respect, and I took you because I thought I could own the world. But you showed me that the only thing worth having is the one thing you can't take by force." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a ghost of a kiss that tasted of the morning air and a quiet, terrifying joy. The physical intimacy was raw and detailed. He moved his hand from her neck to her jaw, his thumb dragging across her lower lip, pulling it down to reveal the pink of her inner mouth. Every centimeter, he whispered, his voice a ghost of the promise that had once been a threat but was now a vow. I told you I would fill your life. I didn't realize you would be the one to fill mine. He kissed her then, a slow, deep reclamation that felt like the final page of a long, violent book. It was a kiss of partnership, of survival, and of a love that had been forged in the hottest fires of the London underworld. Clara responded with everything she had, her hands sliding up his chest to feel the hard, living muscle beneath his shirt, her body molding to his in a way that felt like coming home. As the sun climbed higher, casting a golden path across the waves, Elias led her back inside. The villa was filled with the sounds of their new life, the rustle of silk, the low hum of a radio, and the absence of fear. Julian was gone, settled in a quiet town in the north under a name that didn't carry the weight of debts or shadows. The Bridge Boys were a footnote in the city's dark history. In the silence of their bedroom, Elias held her with a strength that was no longer about power but about protection. He traced the line of her shoulder with his lips, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. "We have today," he murmured against her pulse point, "and we have tomorrow. And every day after that is ours." Clara looked at the man who had been her captor, her protector, and now her partner. She realized that resilience wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about having the courage to stand in the light when the clouds finally parted. They had both been broken, twisted by a world that didn't value mercy, but in each other they had found a way to be whole. The journey that had begun in a rain-slicked alley in Southwark had ended here, on a balcony overlooking the dawn. There were no more debts to be paid, no more secrets to be burned. There was only the heat of their bodies, the steady rhythm of their breathing, and the realization that even in the darkest corners of the world, justice and love could find a way to thrive. As they stood together, watching the new day unfold, Clara knew that they were no longer ghosts. They were the architects of their own fate, and the dawn was just the beginning. Reflecting on their journey, it is clear that true strength lies not in the empires we build, but in the connections we choose to protect. Resilience is the quiet voice that tells us to keep going when the world says to give up, and justice is the peace we find when we finally let go of the shadows of our past.